გამარჯობა. მოგესალმებით. კეთილდღეობის მომზადება ევროპის სახლში მორიგ დისკუსიაზე. დღევანდელი ჩვენი დისკუსია არის ღონისძიებების სერიის ნაწილი. დღევანდელი კონკრეტული დისკუსია ეხება უსაფრთხოებას, ევროპულ უსაფრთხოებას, რუსეთის როლს მასში, საქართველოს შესაძლო ადგილს მომავალში, ამ სტრუქტურაში, ამ სისტემაში. ჩვენი შეიძლება ზოგიერთი თქვენთაგანი იყო წინა დისკუსიაზე, რომელიც ზოგადად პოლიტიკურ მიმოხილვას და ეკონომიკურ საკითხებს ეხებოდა. მომავალში ნოემბერში არის ასევე დაგეგმილი დისკუსიები შიდა პოლიტიკის გავლენაზე საგარეო პოლიტიკაზე, როგორც ევროკავშირში, ისე საქართველოში და რუსეთში. და კიდევ ევროდადებული რიგილი ძალის განაყენებას რუსეთის მხრიდან კონცეფცია რუსული მირის შესახებ და იმედს რომ იმ დისკუსიებზეც გიხილავთ. ეს პროექტი ფინანსდება გერმანიის მარშალის ფონდის პროექტის მიერ, რასაც ეწოდება შავი ზღვის თანამშრომლობის პროექტი, რისთვისაც დიდ მადლობას მოვახსენებ. მე არ მოგაწვენთ ჩვენი სტუმრების წარდგენით, იმიტომ რომ ამას გააკეთებს ჩვენი მოდერატორი თორნიკე turmanidze, საქართველოს საზოგადოებრივი საქმეთა უნივერსიტეტის პროფესორი, რომელსაც მე ხომ გადავცემ სიტყვას. დიდი მადლობა, თორნიკე.
Hello, welcome everybody. Today we have an issue which has been topical not only for Georgia, not only for Russia and Europe, but for everyone in the world, especially after the events in the Ukraine. And today we are going to discuss the situation in the European Union, in wider Europe, so to say, security picture, and possible consequences of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and Georgia's possible role in the future in European security. Today we have three special guests, one of them representing, let's say, the European Union, another Russia, and also my Georgian colleague, former official, now academic, like myself. Stephan is Spiegeleire, Timofey, Bordachev, and Tornike Turmanidze. I will introduce in details each one of them before they make the presentations. Our first presenter is Stephan Spiegeleire, senior analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Formerly, he worked at the RAND Corporation organization I also have been somehow affiliated to. And I guess you had some special interest in Soviet and post-Soviet studies. That's why I think your contribution here could be especially remarkable, because you are quite familiar with this region. Also, you work very heavily and involved also in European security. So please share with us your views on current situation in Europe. I think you can follow my name, and we have exactly 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I did work at RAND for 10 years, and I'm delighted to be back here after 10 years, thanks to Maya and to the whole team and to the sponsors for bringing me back, because a lot of things have changed in Georgia in these past 10 years. I was here for a couple of months, I think, in the period sort of the late Shevardnadze, early Saakashvili period, and we did some trainings of the Georgian National Security Council and of a bunch of other academics and so on. So I spent really a few months. And yesterday, as I came back after 10 years, and I was walking through Rusta Valley, sort of, walking up the mountain towards the tower, television tower, and then continuing on one of my favorite hikes in the whole world, actually, which is when you just keep walking, right? You first walk to the forest, and then you walk to these beautiful agricultural zones towards the small little village there. It's a special mountain there. I mean, they call it Mount David, I think. I forget the exact Georgian name. But it's also a holy mountain. And sometimes these things inspire you. And so as I was walking away from the hustle and bustle of what I saw here on Rusta Valley, with indeed a lot of changes in the past 10 years, but also a lot of things that have not changed yet. And the further you walk away from Rusta Valley, so the more you see these other things happening. As I was walking away from Tbilisi, I sort of took pause. It's been a very busy week for me last week, and I haven't slept very much. And so yesterday was really sort of my day off. And so you reflect then, right? It's been not only a heavy week, it's been a few heavy months because of the situation in Crimea. I used to be a Soviet specialist, by the way, up until like 10 years ago. The research priorities of most think tanks reflect the priorities of the government. So the Soviet Union was a big preoccupation. When the Soviet Union collapsed, or as I like to say, when we successfully concluded that research topic, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we moved on to other topics. And we basically neglected Russia for a very long period of time. And now in these past couple of months, these things are coming back. I haven't done, I told Timofey too, we hadn't done any research on Russia for the past 10 years or so, and now I have 5 projects on Russia. But so again, as I'm walking away from Tbilisi, I sort of, pause to think a little bit about these things. And I like to think about 3 different layers of international security, European security. If you think of history as a stream, which you can, I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's an analogy. There's different layers to the stream. The layer that we are always most interested in is the superficial layer. It's the drama of politics, the drama of politics in Georgia, the drama of politics in the European Union, the drama of politics globally. It's the drama of newspapers, who always zoom in on certain aspects, the dramatic aspects, and neglect a lot of the other much more structural elements. Am I causing some global perturbance here? So the superficial layer of policy, the time horizon there is a little bit longer than that of politics or of newspapers, but it's still fairly short term. Most of us who work for policymakers know how short term their visions are. So that's a superficial layer. When we talk about security, we mostly talk about that layer. But I think there's 2 other layers that I think are much more fundamental to the essence of European security, international security. And so the second layer I would call the structural layer. If you would read newspapers, you would think that the world is getting worse and worse. Whereas the reality, of course, is that there's a dramatic decline in violence. Even this year, there are 9 conflicts fewer in the world than there were last year. You wouldn't get that from what you read in newspapers, right? So something fundamentally is changing to international security. Despite all of this turbulence at the superficial level, something very structural is changing there. And I think it has much more to do with things like technological change, demographic change, educational change, which all have a direct impact on international security, than it has to do with all the decisions that we take at the higher superficial level, we politicians, we policymakers, we analysts who try to support these policymakers. That structural level, I think, is what determines a country's security. It has much more to do with how resilient you are at the structural level than the sort of superficial measures you take. And then finally, I think there's a third level, which is much more profound even. You could call it the cultural level, the identity level, the ideational level. Also there, things are changing. A Georgian has been a Georgian since before the Soviet Union. He was a Georgian during the Soviet Union. I'm talking too fast. How many people are actually listening to the headphones? Yes, there are some. Okay, well, then I will try to slow down. I apologize. So there's something about the Georgian identity that remains quintessentially Georgian. That was there during the Cold War. It is there still now. It will still be there, for better or for worse, for a long time to come. But even these identity layers are also being affected by these very profound global changes that are occurring, that have nothing to do with Putin, that have nothing to do with whoever the president is of this or that country, but it has to do with these structural phenomena that are out there. It seems to me, right, that we as security analysts should focus a lot more on that level. And since now the superficial level is becoming much more difficult, and I will turn to the Russia-EU relationship in a second, since that superficial level will become much more difficult in the coming years, I think that should only make us focus even more on the structural changes, both in this entire post-Soviet sphere, which is still experiencing the dramatic unwinding of that powerful entity that once was the Soviet Union. A tragedy that will go on for a long period of time. It's sort of the waves, the ripple waves of that decline are still very much visible, and much of what we see today is probably part of that. But we should not forget to keep our eye on these fundamental changes. Incidentally, I think that's one of the reasons why the European Union, with all of its failures, is actually quite successful at policy. We do look at the longer term. A lot of these agreements that we conclude, right, which look terribly bureaucratic, nobody has read the DCFTA. It's 1,200 pages of excruciating detail. But that's the superficial hull over something very much more important that has to do with the structural changes of a country. The rule of law changes, the economic changes, all those kinds of things. And I think that's what we should keep our eye on. And I think the nice thing about the European Union is it's trying to go with the flow of things. Whereas I see some other neighbors of ours constantly trying to steer in another direction, saying the direction the stream is going to is wrong, and we want something else. And I'm sure this will come back in the discussion as well. A couple of things on Russia-EU. I think the long-term strategy of the European Union has been, is, and will remain very basic. It's to recouple Russia to Europe and thence to the rest of the world. There may be other vectors through which Russia can interact with the rest of the world. But Europe is a very natural complement that might allow Russia to reintegrate into the global supply chains, into these more fundamental structural realities of international interaction. And that has not changed. It's a long-term, determined strategy that we will continue to pursue. It's a huge neighbor of ours. We share a lot of common history, we share a lot of differences as well, but I think that's the essence of it. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think in Europe we have lived essentially in a unipolar European world. And the pole was the European Union. The Russian Federation, they don't always feel comfortable with this pole. In fact, the relationship between Russia and the European Union has not been rosy by any stretch of the imagination, neither in the Yeltsin period nor in the subsequent periods. But essentially, by and large, Russia played along. It played ball, to put it sort of in American terms. You know, we concluded a bunch of agreements, both with the European Union and with Russia, with NATO, sorry. And so, to a large extent, Russia lived at the neighborhood of a pole, but did not try to position itself as a separate pole. That has changed now. It has been changing for a long period of time. We can quarrel about when it changed, why it changed. It's interesting that we have radically different views about this. We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, I told Timofey, with a bunch of Western European Russian foreign policy experts. And so, as we always do, we presented our papers and then we fought a little bit. And then we also exchanged some views with some Russian colleagues. Entirely different views on when Russian policy changed, why it changed. We think it's because of mostly domestic considerations. The Russians think it's mostly because of all the bad things that we have done from their perception. So very radically different views, but the fact remains, and to me sort of a key point here is the speech that President Putin gave on March 18th, which I call his Goodbye to Europe speech, in which it really becomes clear now that they're trying to construct, again, a bipolar Europe, which makes it much more difficult for all those countries in between to decide, you know, which pole they are on. Because both poles are making it very clear that there's a fundamental incompatibility between these two. I, as an analyst, sometimes wonder, and we've had this discussion before, maybe it'll come back, how incompatible the two really are. But in fact, that seems to be sort of the situation we are in right now. This bipolar Europe between the European Union on the other hand, and a Eurasian Union that Russia is trying to create with very different economic structures, economic rules. So these structural elements that I was talking about in the beginning seem to look very different between these two different things. The European Union and its individual member states were definitely caught by surprise by this. We did not expect this. Some might say we should have seen it coming, or the Crimea was not something that we had expected to happen, Timofey. And so a little bit the reaction was like a deer sort of with the headlights of a car approaching. It had a hard time coming to grips with the changes, but the changes are fundamental. I mean, nobody within the European Union now, diplomats are not the boldest people in the way in which they express their thoughts. Annexation is not a term they like to use, but annexation is now universally accepted. We had a high-level meeting in Paris a couple of weeks ago with all the ambassadors of the permanent, the PSC, the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. They all, were comfortable using that term. So the dynamics within Europe has changed. For the first time now within the European Union, we are getting a common strategy towards Russia. There are still discrepancies, but the sanctions that were agreed upon, a lot of the Eurocrats see as a big achievement for finally, after all these decades that we've tried to do this, now we're getting it. We're not getting it in the way that we wanted it, but it's certainly sort of happening right now. So the dynamics within the European Union are changing dramatically. What is also changing dramatically is the role of NATO in this entire discussion. It has become impossible for Europe not to take the NATO. Most European nations make portfolio investments. You decide how much money to put in which basket. And we have a national basket, we have an EU basket, we have a transatlantic basket. The distribution between these three baskets has changed historically from the national to the European a little bit, and NATO was always there. That balance is changing now. Defense budget in a couple of countries, including the Netherlands, which sort of always felt it was far away from these things, but now, because of things like MH17, more people, almost as many people died Dutch people died in MH17 as died on the Georgian side in the August 2008 war, according to the official statistics of the Ministry of Defense. This is a traumatic event. We don't know quite yet what the cause, what caused, who shut it down, why, this kind of thing. But it's a profound change even for the Netherlands. So defense budgets are going up, defense choices are changing. All the things that Russia said or feared are now being materialized. Relocation of troops, I was very in favor of getting rid of Dutch tanks, because most of the scenarios we were envisaging didn't need tanks. All those decisions are now being reviewed. Large-scale investments that are very hard for European taxpayers and are really only useful from a perspective of a Russian scenario are now being once again becoming much more important. So these are fundamental changes in Europe's response. What does this mean for, and I will end up with these things, for Ukraine and Georgia? Well, what beats me when I look at these two countries is how these two proud nations, Georgia with a history that goes back much longer than Russia's. When you go to Tbilisi, I think they're 10th century before Christ. That's when sort of humanity moved from Africa and started looking to lofty latitudes. But all proud nations, Ukraine, but also an older tradition than the Russian Federation. How those two nations allowed themselves to be so weak in security terms, not in terms of the military that they had, but in terms of the fragility of their country, the poverty, the corruption, the misgovernance in those countries. That is the reality, I think, the primary reality of security. That is what we Europeans should try to help our neighbors with. This is not against somebody. A sort of more stable environment is a healthy environment for both times. But that strikes me first of all. We were not happy with Ukraine prior to all these events. We're still not necessarily happy with Ukraine. There was an enormous amount of Ukraine fatigue. Ukraine has systematically reneged on all the promises of reform. In Georgia too, we've seen the pulse of reform go up and down across time, very inconsistently. But those things, the Ukrainian situation is triggering us again into reviewing the way in which we approach that. And we have to swallow some of that Ukraine fatigue, although it is still there. We have to swallow some of our frustrations about the inconsistent decision of reforms, and especially the implementation of reform. But to me, that's the reality of things. The safeguards, one of the questions that Maya asked us, what are safeguards for Georgia in this new environment? Well, at the institutional level, I would submit there are no safeguards. No sheet of paper that look at the Budapest Agreement, look at, in history is littered with the sort of institutional types of commitments that then ultimately get ignored by some of the actors for whatever circumstantial reasons that they might have. So even our Article 5 in NATO, right, if you look at what actually Article 5 says, if you look at the reality of our defense planning and how capable we would be to respond to a potential Russian threat, these commitments, commitments at the superficial level, I think are always questionable. The real safeguard, it seems to me, for countries in terms of security does not lie at the superficial level. It lies at the structural level. And that's where these very boring things like the association agreements, however, I said, illegible they might be, to me provide a much sounder safeguard for a long-term, resilient, sustainably secure country than any of the other things. And the key aspect here in this, from our point of view, will still remain Russia. We will have to do what we can do for both Ukraine, Russia, and the other things. But our eye has to remain on Russia. A lot of the channels of interaction we have with Russia now will become much more difficult. But I think we have to renew our effort to reach the lower levels of Russia. When you go to Russia today, it's a profoundly different country from 20 years ago. If we go to a new Cold War, which we might, it smells a lot like the Cold War again. And you'll be able to see that in some of the interactions that we have here today, despite the fact that Timofey and I have known each other for a long time and we're quite good friends. So these dynamics have really changed, and I'll wrap up here. But we have to keep our eye on the structural changes in Moscow, in Russia as a whole. Technology is affecting them just as much as it is us. The currents of history are driving Russia and China and India and much of the world in very much the same direction as it does all the rest of us. And so rather than us as politicians, as policymakers, as analysts, trying to push against the tides of history, I think we should try to find ways to jump on the things that are positive. And there's lots of those, as some of the statistics I showed you initially show. There is something happening in the world that's making this world more stable and more resilient. A lot of the things we do in the security realm seem to undermine that more structural stability. I think it's high time, especially now because I said the superficial level will become difficult with Russia, that we really focus on these fundamental things. Educational change, which Russia is working on, economic change, which Russia is working on, and which, you know, again, these currents of history are pushing it into. That, I think, is what we should push on. Right. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephan. The last note was not quite optimistic. If you mean that we have only technological advance to rely on when it comes to Russian
technological change.
Change, okay.
Nanotechnologies
and
information.
Right. Now the floor goes to Timofey Bordachev, let's say one of the most prominent Russian young foreign policy analysts. He caught my eye years ago when I was reading one of my favorite magazines, Russian and Global Affairs. He was an editor-in-chief there, still contributes to this magazine, fortunately. Right now, I am presenting him as director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies. Please, Timofey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, dear guests. For me, this is well a great pleasure to be here. And I'm very thankful to Georgia Eurohouse for inviting me for this event. The first time in my life visiting a beautiful country and being here. Besides my administrative and consultancy duties, I also teach a little bit in my university. I teach the course, the introduction to the theory of international relations for undergraduates. And one of the first things I say during the first lectures, explaining what is the difference between Western, partly including Russian, way of thinking in external relations, and how the rest of the world, the biggest part of the world, China, India, or Asia, think about international relations. So this difference can be explained by the very fact that we believe in the Kingdom of Hague. We believe that we know the ultimate truth, and everybody should go and start to believe in this ultimate truth as well. And more often in Europe and in the United States, less often in my country, though it has been for the 70 years of communist dictatorship, the foreign policy is dominated not by the interest, not by the understanding the subjective feelings of people, but this Christian belief that we know what is the better way for the world to live, and others should listen to us. Chinese are not the same. Indians are not the same. They are not monotheistic religions. They believe that the world is much more flexible, that the people are different, and we cannot put away everybody to the service of the same ideology, communism, liberalism, or any other ideology, Christian ideology. That we need to make people do what they want and how they feel subjectively. And the world which we will construct on these ideas will be the world we are going to live. And we will need both Russia and Europe and Georgia will need to fit their national agendas and interests to the world of tomorrow, which is not our world, but to the world, but not to the world of yesterday, which has been our Eurocentric world. Yes, Stephan, indeed, a lot has changed since we met first time back in 1996. The world has changed as a matter of fact, and it is especially important for all of us to address these important issues in a reasonable, updated and responsible manner. As Europe again, as it has happened many times before, risks to be driven to the confrontation. And the blood has been again shed on the European soil during the last months, as it has happened only after the end of the Cold War, several times in Balkans and in this beautiful country. Today, I believe we can, as I said, we cannot and should not consider the issues of European security out of the general context of the global change. And one cannot even believe that our own policies might be successful and provide a survival for our nations if they are not fit with this new world. So what might be most reality in which we are going to live in the decades to come. The first feature of this new world would be a relative decline of the power of the West. Still very strong, still very assertive, as it has always been, but not able to dominate anymore, as some would believe only 15 years ago, when NATO crashed Yugoslavia without any international endorsement. Going beyond their immediate periphery, both the United States and Europe wasted their moral capital. And without this capital, without the belief of the people of India, China, Africa, Latin America, their still lasting immense military superiority of the West cannot be converted to political leadership anymore. So having NATO as the most armed to teeth, as we say, bloc in the history of humanity does not help the Western nations to lead the world. So something has changed tremendously. Now the West is doing even worse. Now the West is putting the greatest achievements of economic globalization, such as freedom of transactions, under the risk, whilst waging the economic war against Russia, again without any international endorsement. The second feature of the new world is the decomposition of the international governance as it has emerged after the end of the Cold War. The best example of this was demonstrated during the United Nations General Assembly vote on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Just imagine, one country in Europe has agreed to accept the part of another country to become its sovereign territory. The United States Secretary of State runs crazy to proceed the punishment, but nearly half of the nations in the General Assembly either abstain or do not vote, including such as the allies of the United States as Israel. And none of the big non-Western countries voted in favor of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Something has changed in this world. We did not anticipate this change even 10 years ago. Related to this above-mentioned process is the objective decline of the international institutions. Basically, all formal institutional arrangements we have now in Europe and beyond have survived the end of the Cold War. So basically, we inherited them from the Cold War. And through all the last 25 years, the West, with the support of the brilliant analysts like Stephan, the West had numerously tried to make use of these institutions, which can feed Western interests and strategies. It turned to be impossible. Though even today we can see some optimistic signs in the activities of OSCE, for example. The other trend, the next one, is the rise of Asia and the shift of the global agenda to Asia, to the East Asia and Pacific. And consequently, the core issues of sovereignty will be more and more often discussed not in the whole Europe terms, but in a quite conservative manner, as they are seen in the United States, China, other Asia-Pacific powers. Europe is still very important. Europe is still the intellectual center of the world. But Europe is becoming more and more on a political periphery. It can put Europe under the threat of becoming just a playground for the other powers, as it happens today in the relationship between Russia and the US. I feel terribly sorry for those Dutch people and other people who died in the plane crash. But I don't know who did it. And I have many reasons to believe that those who profited politically most could do it. And Europeans suffer from the disagreements in which they have no stakes. But these global changes, all these global changes, do not imply that a new almighty power is about to emerge. Let's say China, for example, and set out the principles as well as provide military power for the implementation of these principles. The world, we, Russia, Georgia, European Union, going to live and fit our national agendas and interests will not be based on the clear structure and institutional arrangement. But it might be, and I believe should be, based on the rules of behavior. And among these rules, the responsibility for what we are doing, for what we are saying, for what we are putting on the on the Facebook, the responsibility must be the core word and principle. Our policy should responsibly take into account the subjective interests of our neighbors and try not to harm. The second rule must be moderate use of force. The military power should not be directed to achievement of the absolute gains. It should become, again, a continuation of political intentions and actions. And the regions and the states should know when and where to stop with their offense. Not trying to remove the leader of the state, even if they don't like this leader of the state, but stop their paratroopers at a certain distance from the capital of another country without being able to take this capital, but putting the self-restriction on them. So regime change should not be considered as a foreign policy goal. We, in other words, should know when and where to stop. And we should always think about when and where to stop in our action. In this new world, the confrontations and disagreements will not imply a final great battle after which the winner takes it all. Most likely, we are entering an era of a classical diplomacy backed up by the force. And nuclear deterrence, the only positive legacy of the 20th century for relations between people, will prevent us from sliding into the big war. Thus, the best conclusion for the West, the best practice which the West and Europe should adapt, might be to forever abandon the idea of a zero-sum game based on the logic we win, they lose, invented by the late American President Ronald Reagan. Europe has been, for the last couple of decades, concentrating its way to do the things as the only option, and thinking in the zero-sum principle, it should be banned. And last but not least, let us believe that the worst legacy of the 20th century, nationalism, and dragging regular people into international conflicts will vanish. In this new world of power diplomacy, it must be imperative to prevent every conflict from turning into the great patriotic war. The interests of states have always clashed. The states in the human history have always seized territories from each other and even waged wars. But these conflicts were never about brutalizing ordinary citizens in the warring countries. We will have to lock away the demon of nationalism and make international politics a matter for diplomats and, unfortunately, soldiers. But now, before I finish, let me answer some of the concrete questions you put in the invitation letter. I think it can save some time from our discussion as well. So you ask, among them, your first question, what's next for European security and Russia-European Union relations after the Ukrainian crisis events? I have tried to answer in my previous commitments, my previous comments, by putting into the wider international agenda. What role is there for Georgia in the European security architecture? I see Georgia as an experienced and responsible member of European and wider international community. Due to geostrategic and personal reasons, this country has really suffered some very bad experiences and has, I believe, much better knowledge of how high might be the price of impatience. The other question, is Russia a threat to European security? Well, it is, in the same way as the United States, European Union, or Georgia. So long as the states see their national interests and security subjectively, and this will last forever, any of them can be a threat to regional security. And if we defend our interests with an iron fist, as the US and some European states did many times during the last 25 years, and Russia did, we always put a wider security under the risk. Is the association agreement with the European Union a safeguard for Georgia? Well, it depends in my view on the other question. Safeguard against what? History proves that the best safeguard, and I conclude with the same what you have said, basically, the history proves that the best safeguard is our own wise and responsible policy, our homework, not our commitments for the external partners. Because here we put our internal stability under the risk of the international security. And the policy which does not make your neighbors to feel bad. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to make one comment. You just said that Europe imposed sanctions against Russia without international endorsement. I didn't know it's international endorsement because Russia imposed sanctions against Georgia in 2006 as well, without international endorsement.
I should have said, as Russia did in 2006, yes.
And I will give you much more examples.
Yeah.
Now the floor goes to Tornike Turmanidze, former official at National Security Council and Ministry of Internal Affairs. Currently, he is the associate professor at the State University of International Relations. My namesake, and let's say my colleague. Our biographies go pretty like each other.
Thank you very much. Stephan and Timofey mostly talked about the global or the international level of security, while I try to prepare my presentation more on the regional and local issues. So to say, the view from Georgia, how Georgia views regional security and international security. My presentation will be mostly touching several topics. I will talk about what is the geopolitical situation in Europe's east right now, and what are the main challenges or threats in the eastern dimension of the European security, where I also put Georgia geographically. Also touching upon the Ukrainian example, I'd like to elaborate what Georgia can learn from the war in eastern Ukraine right now, or for that matter, what Ukraine might have learned from the Russian-Georgian War in 2008. And last, what should Georgia do, what should Ukraine do, what should other small, weak states lying between Russia and EU and NATO do in future to safeguard their national security. I would start by depicting the picture and the interests of the main players and main actors in the game of European security. In my view, and I know that most people in Georgia, especially after the 2008 war, share this view, is that Russia is not a status quo power. It's a revisionist power which is not content with the situation created in Europe after the end of the Cold War, and especially after Vladimir Putin came to power. Russia is trying to reintroduce its sphere of influence. Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union a geopolitical tragedy, and now, since then, especially Russia is trying to drag the 12 post-Soviet states. Fortunately, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, escaped from Russia, and they managed into the European Union and NATO, but unfortunately the other 12 nations are in flux, so to say, and Russia is trying to drag them into its sphere of influence in one way or another. The first form was the CIS, which apparently was not enough for the current Russian government, and now they devised a new concept of the Eurasian Union, and they're trying to lure or drag by force the other 12 nations which are part of the Soviet Union. We saw in 2008 that in order to fulfill its purposes, Russia is able and has actually used military force to grab additional chunks of lands from its neighboring territories. We used to warn the US, Europe, the whole world that this was not the end, that this was not an isolated case, and now in 2014 we saw the same scenario evolve in Ukraine when Russia started a military invasion, occupied certain territories like they did in Georgia in 2008, then annexed the territory. So this is part of the big game that Russia is playing from our Georgian perspective, that it's trying to recreate the lost sphere of influence or the sphere of privileged interest, as former President Dmitry Medvedev said just after the 2008 August Russia-Georgia war. So this neo-imperialist ambition is quite clear from the Russian side. Now the next question is, what does Europe want? What is the eastern dimension of European security? What is the purpose of the policy of the European Union, NATO, and the West in general? It seems that the West really, well, at least until the Ukrainian events, thought that the Cold War is over, that Russia is willing to be a normal player and a contributor to the European global security, but in fact it is not, because it is not content with the status quo that is right now, and is trying to change the situation on the ground, to change even the borders. And therefore, Europe, of course, wants to see stable Russia, modernizing Russia, not aggressive Russia. It wants to see all the small, weak states lying in between Russia and the European Union and NATO, like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, as stable countries which are developing, which have good relations both with Russia and the West, and which some of them may be willing to get closer to Europe and to help them in doing so. But we see that the goals of the Russian Federation and the European Union, NATO and the West in general are contradictory in this respect. What do the small, weak states lying in between Russia and EU NATO want? Well, Georgia clearly wants to be part of the Western civilization, or as you said, the Western pole. So we want to be able to choose which pole we would like to belong to. The same can be said more or less about Ukraine and Moldova, which at different times, and there has been a fluctuation, especially in the Ukrainian foreign policy, also want to be closer to Europe. We cannot say the same about Belarus or Armenia, and the question of Azerbaijan is also a bit tricky. But at least from my country, I can say that we want to be part of the EU, part of NATO, and this choice is, of course, made because of our national security priorities. We want to be safeguarded from certain threats, and unfortunately the main threat here is the Russian Federation. But we also want to be part of Europe because we feel European, and we feel that we have European values, and that Georgia, as an ancient Christian nation, always belonged to the European civilization, and due to certain historical ties was sort of detached from Europe and then became part of Russia and the Soviet Union. And now we have a chance to sort of get back to the European civilization. What are the main challenges in this situation to the security situation in Europe's east? The main challenge is, of course, that after having annexed Crimea, before that, after having occupied Abkhazia and South Ossetia, 20% of Georgian territory, Russia is continuing to sort of anschluss additional territories. The main challenge here, and we, the Georgians, believe that Europeans should understand that, is to somehow stop Russia at this point. We also understand that the West, as Timofey said, is in a way getting weaker. The European Union may be also getting weaker, and they cannot roll back what Russia has already conquered. But at least they should have the power with sanctions, more active sanctions, with whatever instruments there are in foreign policy to stop Russia where it is right now. What has Georgia learned from the Ukrainian experience? And first of all, what Ukraine might have learned from the Georgian experience. Ukraine might have learned that Russia is able and willing to use military force and to violate the territorial integrity of a neighboring country using the Kosovo precedent as a justification. But, well, maybe they could use the Kosovo precedent as a justification for occupying Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but annexing Crimea is a totally different step, and it seems that the Russian government is using this Kosovo example to justify anything that they might be doing in their neighborhood. What Georgia has to learn from the Ukrainian experience is that we remember the government of Yanukovych said that Ukraine would be neutral, would be a non-bloc nation. They wrote that in the constitution. They gave a lease to the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. So basically, Ukraine under Yanukovych did what the Russian government has been demanding all the time, and what it is demanding from Georgia, to be a neutral, non-bloc nation. But the more Ukraine yielded, the more Russia demanded. So it seems that Russia does not see a difference between NATO and the EU. It sees both organizations and the possibility of small nations of the post-Soviet space signing association agreements with the EU as a similar threat as them getting membership action plans in the North Atlantic Alliance. Therefore, the next question is, what should Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, other nations do? In no way they should declare themselves neutral, because we saw what was the effect of this neutrality for Ukraine. We should continue on our path to Europe and the North Atlantic Alliance. I don't know when Georgia will get there, if it will ever get there, but it should continue to cooperate, to approximate with the European Union and NATO, hoping that the situation which is created right now will be freezed at a certain point, and Russia won't grab additional territories of Georgia. The same for Ukraine. I know I'm saying a bad thing, that realistically both the Ukrainian government and the Georgian government may not be able to regain the territories which we lost. But there's a worst case scenario of having these countries totally lost. Therefore, the interest, and again I'm saying this is a bad case scenario of course for our countries, is to freeze the situation with the help of the European Union by introducing international peacekeeping forces, by somehow stopping this aggression at the line of fire where it is right now. There is a certain territorial price which Georgia, Ukraine have paid for being pro-Western and for wanting to be part of the West. But we want this to be the last prize, and sort of to be able to freeze the situation and to build our states, develop democracy and so on, to have a peaceful environment where in which we can develop. Yes, I'm finishing. And in the end, I would say that there is a very dangerous opinion, in my view, in the West, in the United States, in the European Union, that NATO did bad when it expanded and that it irritated Russia, and all Russia wants is a stable, neutral buffer zone around its border to the east with the European Union and NATO, to the southwest with Turkey, to the south with Iran, and to the east with China. But this is not true, because as we saw in the case of Ukraine, declaring yourself neutral, and I think that will be the case with Moldova as well, saying that, okay, I won't be part of any military alliance, does not make sense. Because again, as I said, Russia views any independent policy carried out by these nations as a threat. Therefore, Russians also saw the signing of the association agreements with the European Union by Georgia, by Ukraine, by Moldova as a threat to their national security. And the final point is that, of course, I don't know how to get out of the situation, but I know what Georgia wants, and we need a helping hand of the West in general to stop Russia at this point and to have a possibility to continue developing our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Tornike. Don't you think that one of the lessons we learned from the Ukrainian events is that when you attacked, nobody's going to help you, we help you. Now, before we accept questions from the audience, if our presenters have any questions for each other or any comments, do you?
Sure.
Okay.
Somebody, you want me to start? That's why I say start first.
Sure, let's go.
I'll let Russia start first.
Okay, we usually do last. Well, Stephan, I like what you have said theoretically. And about these high-level politics, how do you call them?
Well, I thought about dramatic, superficial.
Dramatic, superficial. I don't believe that those people who died in eastern Ukraine or in Georgia 6 years ago will agree with you that these politics are not essential. I think those people and their relatives of those Georgians, Ossetians, Russians, Ukrainians who died, Dutch will disagree with you. And they will say, no, boy, please take care about those things which bring the death to our houses. This is a question to you.
Yeah, sure.
I think that here you a little bit live in a different reality, as this question would say now.
Look, my point, I mean, of course, we all regret the loss of life. The point is what you do about it. And it's a response to these kinds of things, the old-fashioned, your whole sort of argument is we go back to the past. We may regret it, but interests are back, geopolitics are back. I'm saying I see that too. But I think the people who only focus on that part of the picture systematically underestimate the other part of the picture, which is these very profound ties of history that seem to be pushing not in the direction the West wants, but the direction of sort of more economic efficiency, more technological innovation. Those are very profound forces. And I think they overwhelm you. So we should try to avoid any loss of life that occurs, right? But the way in which we do it, do we spend money on more traditional means, and we need this and we need that, or do we try to find additional ways, other ways, complementary ways? And I think the experience of European security after World War II has been the latter. It's a lesson we paid with a lot more blood that has been spilled in the past couple of years and this year, both Russian blood and Western blood. And the conclusion we drew from that is that there are alternative ways of solving these kinds of issues. We do not have to go back to the past. If certain leaders or countries want to go back to the past, let them try. What I observe, for instance, in Russia right now is an attempt, another experiment with the Russian population, to impose import substitution policies which have demonstrably not worked, not because they're anti-Western, but a lot of different parts of the world have tried this in the 70s and they failed miserably. Import substitution is not a solution. It will weaken the healthy fibers of the Russian economy that exist right now, who want to see the whole world as their oyster, and not just the little sort of unit that you will carve out around yourself, whether it's just in the CIS or the Eurasian Union or the BRICS or however you want to define them. That is my answer. We don't have to go back to the past. In fact, we are not going back to the past because these engines of change, which are much more powerful than any individual politician or any individual ideology, are pushing us all in that direction. That is the argument, Timofey. You know, a lot of you, I want to actually make a point about the Ukraine and Crimea, of course.
Then you
Can we make it
okay. Well, I agree that this is a modern world, this is important to develop economics and not to show how cool we are. But tell me, what will be a comparison between military spending of NATO, including the United States, and Russia and China? Who spends more on being cool, being the strongest? You do, not me. You aren't up to
yes, but a lot of
the story about that's the answer not fashionable. I mean, there's a contradiction.
I have to stop this. I have to stop the debate. Sorry. Yeah. The first question from the Boba, it's you. Yes, we are. Introduce how that moment.
Могу по-русски тоже.
Machine said you go on That's my frequencies first. First frequency, yes. First? Yes.
Interprestuse jurnalisti Bendeliani Kopa. ვერ წარმოვიდგინეთ რა ინტერესით მოვდიოდი და მინდა გითხრათ რომ ამ შენობიდან ასე უინტერესო აზრებით მივდივარ. მე პირდაპირ ვიცი ლაპარაკი. ქვედან ხელ მარცხნი ქვენი კოლეგა ისეთი რამე გითხრა რომ აი საქართველოს მოქალაქე რო იყოს ალბათ პრინციპში ალბათ სისხლის სამართლის საქმე უნდა ავიღოთ. ჩვენს დროს სტუმარზე ვსაუბრობ. თქვენ რა შეგეშლება? რუსმა კოლეგამ თქვა ასეთი რამ. მოკლედ რა თქვა? ისინი ევროპა მსოფლიოს ინტელექტუალური ცენტრია. ხوارიშტე ის რაც ევროპამ ამ 2-6 თუნდაც უკანასკნელი წლების განმავლობაში ჩვენ გაგვანახა შეიძლება ითქვას რომ ინტელექტუალური იმპოტენტია. იმიტომ ეს ასე კარგად ხმამაღად ვლაპარაკობს. არადა რა გითხრა. პირველი ჩვენ შევდივართ კლასიკური დიპლომატიის ერაში, რომელიც გამაგრებულია ძალით. ესე იგი, რუსმა სტუმრობამ მითხრა, რაც გავაკეთე, ეხლა მე ამას დიპლომატიით მოვერცხმოვას ვთავაზ. მეორე, ნაციონალიზმი. გვეუბნება ის ხალხი, რაც ნაციონალ შოვინიზმი თავის პოლიტიკის თავარ ინსტრუმენტად აქცია. მესამე, ევროპელებს უნდა ესმოდეთ, რომ საჭიროა რუსეთის გაჩერება. შესანიშნავი აზრია, მაგრამ ვინ ამის გამოყენება. და ბოლო ჭუის დარიგება, რომელიც ჩვენ რუსის ტურისგან მივიღეთ და ეხლა ძალიან პოზიციაში რომ ეხლა ეს კითხვასაც შემოვაყროთ. ესე იგი, ვითხრა მაგაც რომ საქართველოს საერთაშორისო კონფლიქტებში არ უნდა ჩაერთოს. კითხვის ასი ასეთი. პირველი, ჩვენს ევროპას. მე წერა ვთქვი, რომ ევროპამ ინტელექტუალური იმპოტენცია გამოავლინა. ეთანხმებით თუ არა ჩემ ამ მოსაზრებას და რატომ იყო ასეთი ინტელექტუალური, ასეთი Europa. Asta e ciumă, asta e scenara, ori это сватается. Даже если по-русски. По-русски скажу, можно, да? Практически то, что вы нам сказали, мы слышим каждый день от Первого канала. Ключ, я вообще, честно говоря, да, уже не слушаю. Уже не слушаю. Вы так симпатично выглядите, что никак не похожи на Путина. А говорите, словно он перед нами. А элегантно выглядит. Знаете, вопрос, знаете, вот каждый день мы пытаемся наблюдать, читать, правда, скоро и такой возможности у нас не будет, следить за интернетом, судя по тем законопроектам, которые в Думе рассматриваются. Но пытаемся как-то понять вас, и никак понять не можем. У меня вопрос вам такого содержания. Неужели кто-то, где-то, как-то, в том числе и вы, рассчитываете, что следуя той политике, которую сегодня Россия проводит, в общем-то можно достичь тех целей, в том числе геополитических, которые у Кремля есть? Последние 20 лет же показали совсем обратное. Вот говорит человек, что эти страны хотят? Украина, Молдова. Безопасность и нормальное развитие. Кто нам дает нормальное развитие? Православный танк российский в 40 километрах от Тбилиси. Как можно нормально спать, зная, что это так? Извините, может, я очень долго говорю, но если даже не ответить, я не обижусь, потому что я привык, что на такие вопросы в общем-то не отвечаю, потому что на них ответов нет. То, что вы нам сказали, европейский гость. Но я, извините меня, вот и у русских есть, вы хотите вот всех собак вешать на нас, не получится. А коллега из России сказал, я себя вел, как веду, буду вешать на вас каждый день собак, по шапке буду бить и по заднице каждый день, и вы меня слушаетесь. Вы знаете, по-моему, 21 век, не 17, не 21, не 19. Кстати, извините, я очень интересно не так вспомнил. Вот мы сейчас находимся на улице, Емельяновская она когда-то называлась. Вот всего в 20 метрах отсюда, наверное, вы считали Хаджи Мурат. Голова Хаджи Мурата специально вот здесь была вывешена, в 20 метрах отсюда. Как жестоко Россия, чтобы другим назидание было. Так прошли мы эти этапы. Хватит, надоело. Все, извините, спасибо.
Let's answer to this long and emotional question first, and then others ask the other questions. So if you get...
Well, I just want to say something about the intellectual impotence argument, which, you know, it may look like. Look, you guys are crying, stop Russia. Russia, under current circumstances, cannot be stopped. Our leverage over Russia is fairly minimal. We are interconnected with her, so we are just as beholden to these deeper currents of interdependence and those kinds of things, which are, I think, ultimately positive things, than anybody else is. But there is another Russia. I mean, right now we live in the sort of afterglow of the euphoria of Crimean but other things are changing in Russian society as well. It's not just the foreign policy that is changing, domestically things are changing as well. It seems to me, there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street in Moscow a couple of years ago. There was a growing middle class, the result of this more fundamental current of history that's out there, that will not put up with these kinds of things. And it started, the sanctions here, which is what we are doing, are, you may call it intellectual impotence, but it's one of the few instruments that we have, however feeble, to try to affect situations. You do not need international approval for that. If there is something wrong with WTO rules, we will fight it out in that particular environment. But sanctions are starting to hit. I was on the plane from Helsinki to St. Petersburg a while ago, and there was a couple sitting next to me who was living in Vyborg. And so they were flying back from vacation. They had sort of followed everything, all the events in Ukraine from their vacation home. They were not political. They were pro-Putin. They were proud of that the Crimea was again ours, as they say it. But they had been talking to their family, saying that their favorite food, Western food that was in the stores, was no longer available. They were afraid that they were not going to be able to buy their favorite designer things. These are the kind of things that hurt. So intellectual impotence, I mean, you have to take the realities of the world into consideration and still see what you can do about that. Our first instinct was these sanctions. And we still have a couple of gradations that we can accelerate. Will that stop Russia? Will it roll back? No. Will it stop it? Who knows? It seems to me that, again, our focus should be on Russian society. Putin keeps talking about the fifth column. I don't think we have to go back to the Cold War and try to give money to all sorts of organizations that might do. Regime change is not our objective, Timofey. Our objective is a more normal Russia in which the развитие and безопасность that Russia itself wants, and which is now being hurt. I'm constantly reminded of the differences between Germany and Russia. Germany, after 2 terrible centuries of violent attempts to expand itself, found itself on the ground and was able in a few decades to build around itself a circle, not a ring of fire, but a buffer of friends, countries who may still not love Germany, but who have respectful relationships with it. I see Russia going the other direction, in which a country like Georgia, which traditionally has not been viscerally anti-Russian, where people still speak fluent Russian, increasingly you have these kinds of statements, where you have the same kind of statements, visceral. I was on the Maidan 2 days ago, and people are walking on the street, yelling against Russia, the visceral anti-Russianism, which has been resuscitated now. Does that help Russian future? So intellectual impotence, first of all, a lot of the innovation does not come from intellectuals, as we know from a lot of experience. I think, again, it comes from these deeper forces, and I think we should be smarter in piggybacking on those. And piggybacking on those means, to me, recognizing that there's only so much we can do at the Russian political level. We cannot force Putin to roll back. We cannot even force him to stop. We will try. I mean, more sophisticated anti-tank. I mean, there are a couple of military tools that certainly Americans will be willing to contemplate, and that there's a couple of positioning changes that will occur and are occurring within NATO. But that again is no guarantee. Putin did not use his powerful military muscle. He used special forces with a gigantic propaganda machine and with Ziloni Tcharevsky, right? So it's a different environment in which traditional military muscle is much less useful, both on our side and on the other side, and where we have to think about how we can continue these profound forces that are also affecting Russia. When you walk through Moscow today, it's a splendid European city with a lot of creative things happening, with a lot of healthy fibers, economic fibers, societal fibers developing. I'm afraid that what's happening now is going to set Russia back a few years, but our eye has to keep on the ball, and that is the normalization of Russia, not along our muster, but just in line with the profound trends in international history.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. I think Timofey he belongs to the middle class definition. We should ask him whether he feels uncomfortable with sanctions or not.
Yeah, is there anything you feel uncomfortable with, Timofey? What's happening in Russia now? Or are you just leaving it alone? Sorry.
Are you chair?
No, sorry.
Okay.
Well, I just wanted to respond to the question, which was quite obvious. Well, my answer will be, I understand your feelings. I entirely understand your feelings, and by my basic education, I am a historian. I know the diplomatic history of my country. I know how Georgia was taken 200 years ago, what trick was done with Georgia. I know what has happened 100 years ago. I know what has happened 6 years ago. But I am in the science of international relations. And from the perspective of the science of international relations, I explain that the countries, the feeling of security is a subjective feeling, and the countries fight for their national interest with an eye on peace. So, and this is a choice of the other countries how to survive. So we all achieve the same goal, the survival. And the ultimate goal is survival of our people.
The goal is the well-being of the individual country.
So we make the choice of the instruments which are available for us. So the countries all are equal by the structure as entities. The instruments they have are different. We did not like watching you bombing Yugoslavia without any international endorsement. We didn't like your special forces storming Tripoli with their barbs trying to look like Arabs. We did not like many things you did during the last 25 years, and the world didn't like it either. So, and now I believe that the West will suffer consequences of its behavior. It will go farther and farther. Believe me, most of the time I spent not on the European front, but in Asia, in interaction with our partners in the Asia Pacific. And the change is substantial. And this change goes along with globalization, and this change is changing, I'm sorry for saying that, the entire international landscape. And my country adjusts itself to the changing international landscape by the means we have in our disposal. Well, speaking about sanctions, I don't think that, do you feel that as a Dutch citizen, as somebody living in Dutch, the problems of Dutch farmers?
Not really.
So the Dutch
are very agile.
Sorry?
They are very agile. They very quickly found other markets.
This is very good. So a couple of days before I went here, I went to one of the big food stores, and I see the cabbage, which has been previously Polish one. Now this is a Russian cabbage, much better quality. Much better quality, believe me. Sorry? No, this is not for sure. I can show my mobile. So all this stuff which I wear, I can buy in China. That was a big. Now Russia has a unique chance to rebalance its external economic relationship, because our trade has been too much connected to European Union, because of corruption as well, because we know how successful are European business partners in corrupting the third partners, like French in the pharmaceuticals and Swiss in pharmaceuticals and some others. I can give you many examples from my profession. So all these things we can import from China and from Asia Pacific countries without any problem. We can get technologies there, but this is a problem for us. This is a homework which we must do. We now have a unique chance to think about our own country, about improving the business climate, about opening not only to the West but also to the East, about better regulation. And it will help us to benefit from this international tragedy which we are now witnessing in Europe.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Please.
Thank you for your donations and open minded. As well as a Georgian citizen, I would like to ask our Russian friend, what does it mean Russian war, and where is its yes, and where is its border, geographical borders?
Let's collect another question.
Prashik politologi Kaufmann's University. ჩემი შეკითხვა არის სხვავი მართულებით, რა მეგონა რომ გარკვეულწილად სპეციფიურია გეომეტრიის შეფასების პიტაპირი თემა არ იყოს, მაგრამ აი ან აქტუალურია, როცა უსაფრთხოებაზე და უშუალოდ უნდა საუბრობ, ეს ალოგნი ახალი და შეიძლება უფრო საშიში გამოწვევა და დიდი საფრთხე, რომელიც ისლამურ სახელმწიფოს სახით იქმნება, ან შეიქმნა ახლო აღმოსავლეთში და რომელიც ემუქრება არა მარტო ევროპას, ცენტრალურ ევროპას საუბარი, არამედ მთლიან მსოფლიოს, შეიძლება ამერიკასაც, ალბათ რუსეთსაც, გარკვეულწილად, იმიტომ ნაწილობრივ ჩეჩნეთასაც ტერორისტები არიან და საქართველოს უშუალოდ დგას, აკისნაც არიან იქ ჩვენი თანამოქალაქენი, ასე ვთქვათ, და გაჟღერდა ჩვენს მედია სივრცეში ასეთ ინფორმაცია, რომ შესაძლებელია ჩვენი დასავლელი პარტნიორების ძალისხმევით მოხდეს სწორედ საქართველოში რაღაც ანტიასადური ოპოზიციური ძალების თუ რაღაც გარკვეული სამხედრო რაციონები აი პრინციპში სუპარას ვეკითხებ აი ერთი მხრივ შეიძლება ესე იგი საკითხი დადგეს ასეთი რომ ის რისკები რომელიც მოყვება ჩიტალურობას და ჩვენ ჩარევას ამ საკითხო აი ამ საერთოდ ვთქვათ ანტიტერორისტულ კოალიციაში. არ თუ არა აწონილ-დაწონილი ჩვენი უშიშროების საბჭოს მიერ შეიძლება ვიკამათოთ იმაზე, რა ჩვენი ევროპული არჩევანი და ვთქვათ თქვენ ახსენეთ რომ აი ქრისტიანები რომ ვართ, ასეც სხვა ახლობებს ევროპასთან, შეიძლება ვიღაცას რომ მართლმადიდებლები რომ ვართ, ეს სხვა ახლობს რუსეთთან. მაგრამ ფაქტი არის რომ ვართ ქრისტიანები ისე რუსები და ევროპელები. ანუ გვაქვს საერთო და ჩვენ რადიკალურად გვასწორებს აი ამ რადიკალურ ისლამს, რომლის საფრთხეს არ აქვს.
გაზრებული იყო ეს ამი გაზრებული.
არა, ეს ერთი ჩვენი მოქმედება. მეორე კითხვა არის ასეთი. ფაქტი არის აი ისლამთან ბრძოლა, პირველთან ბრძოლის მაგალითი ბოლო 20 წლის განმავლობაში იყო ალბანიაში თქვა ისლამის ნავთობის ბრძოლა. დასავლეთის ნაკლებად ეფექტური გამოდგა და არ არის დამარცხებული. ერთადერთი რეალურად ესეთი პრეცედენტი იმისა ფაქტი, რომ რომელიმე ქვეყანა შეძლო თავის ქვეყანაში უშუალოდ თავის საზღვრებში ისლამურ ტერორისტებს დამარცხება და რუსეთი. ხო? მოასწრა თავად მოახერხა ჩეჩნეთში ორგანიზება და თქვა ტერორისტების განდევნა, ანუ ისლამური ტერორიზმის საფრთხის აღმოფხვრა თავის ქვეყანაში. ამიტომ ჩვენ ყველას უნდა ვკითხო, რა გამოცდილება შეიძლება გაიზიაროს ანტიისლამურმა თუ ანტიტერორისტულმა კოალიციამ რუსეთისა, რას ურჩევდით მათ ამ ბრძოლაში და რა პირობებში არის შესაძლებელი რუსეთის ჩართვა ამ ანტიტერორისტულ კოალიციაში, იმიტომ ეს მართლა გლობალური საფრთხეა, რომელიც მე როგორც ქართველს კი მართალია. შეიძლება გერმანიის მოქალაქე ვიყო და უფრო თავად, მაგრამ არც იქ ავიქნები და ვთქვათ უსაფრთხო, იმიტომ რომ ევროპასაც ემუქრება ეს საფრთხე, რაც ძალიან ბევრი არის. ადგილობრივები გერმანელებიც გადადიან ისლამზე. ანუ იდეოლოგიურ ომსახებს ევროპა. ასე ვთქვათ. და ევროპელ სტუმართან შესაბამისი კითხვა, ხო აი რა შეიძლება რომ დაუპირისპიროს ამ რადიკალურ ტერორისტულ ისლამურ იდეოლოგიას და ერთიანი სტრატეგია როგორ გესახება თქვენ ბატონებო, როგორც ევროპის, ისე ამერიკის, ისე საქართველოს და ისე რუსეთის, იმიტომ რომ ჩვენ კი ვიზახით ახლა სტოპ რაშა, მაგრამ ისე არ გაგვიხდეს საქმე, რომ ისევ ერთმოწმობლებთან გაგვიხდეს მერე დაცვის თხოვნით მიმართვა, როცა ჩვენთან მოხდება უშუალოდ ტერორისტების შემოსვლა და აქ ტერორული აქტიას შესაძლებელი.
Quite honestly, I have problems by myself with defining what is a Russian war. I don't think that it was a good idea to invent this notion. I don't think that this is a workable idea. For me, as a scholar of international relations, it sounded like a certain similarity with what our friends in Yugoslavia have said in the 90s. And this was trying to accumulate all the Serb-populated regions. But Russia is not Serbia. We cannot rely on analysis. And I think that the concept was invented by their quarters of administration, which I do not consult. So I will never advise to do it. And I think it is considered by many as a sort of equivalent of the American promise to protect American citizens everywhere. That America will hit any country which will threaten or kill American citizens. I think that the idea behind is exactly that. So this concept must be considered not as a philosophical, but as an instrumental concept. It will be my research academic guess, because I'm not in this business. And the second on the Islamic terrorism, first of all, we should not antagonize Islamic world. No way. We should not follow the policy of antagonizing Islamic world. The people have their own right to believe in what will be the best way to live for them. This is the first. Second, I know that, I'm not in this debate, but I know that for many now in Russia, it is very difficult.
I mean Islamic State, not Islamic war.
Yes, speaking about Islamic State and this Islamic State of Lebanon and Syria, I know that for many in Russia, it is very difficult to understand why we should cooperate with those who has grown this Islamic movement while trying to remove the Syrian regime. We don't know why Americans have supported opposition in Syria, including the radical Islamists. Now they call us to fight them. So, okay, this is their own hot bricks. Why should we care about it? This is very difficult to explain to people in Russia. But I will say again, as to this Russian war, this is not my part of consultancy.
Let's hear again first. He has worked for National Security Council, and maybe he will give us answer. There are rumors that our government has been offered, our government has offered the United States to train personnel. Still, if such decision would be made, how would it benefit Georgia? How, let's say, how would it be justified?
First of all, before getting to that question, I would like to elaborate on what Timofey said in theoretical terms. Timofey said that all states in the current international system are equal, but unfortunately, some states are more equal than the others. And the problem is that, as Timofey said, every country, including Russia, wants survival. Yes, that is true, but survival is the minimal objective of a state, and there are other objectives as well. A small state may have this minimal objective, but a big state like Russia, and we see it in Ukraine, in Georgia, and all around Russia's neighborhood, is not content with survival. It is willing to influence other states and hence to be not equal with the others, and that is the source of the problem for Georgia per se. Now, as for the ISIS and the Islamic threat and so on, unfortunately for Georgia right now, I mean, I don't know what will be after 5 years or 10 years, but at this point, the source of threat is unfortunately coming from an Orthodox nation. Therefore, religion may not be a good way of distinguishing friends and allies in this respect. Plus, I remember Vladimir Putin recently said that Islam may be closer to the Orthodox religion, their Catholicism, Protestant denomination, or so on. So this is also confirming that we, even in the far future, may not rely on Russia if ISIS becomes a more serious threat. As for Georgia potentially hosting the moderate Syrian rebels, that is a very tricky proposal. And it seems to me that part of the Georgian government made this proposal to the U.S. colleagues, or maybe the proposal was coming from the U.S. Anyway, at this point, another part of the Georgian government is denying it. But the question is that whether this is viable, whether this is good for the country or bad if carried out. Each government should make a cost-benefit analysis. If there is something that our American partners are offering us in exchange for this proposal, and if, again, I mean, this should be something serious like a safeguard guarantee, like at least a status of a non-NATO ally or something like that, which was denied to Ukraine by the Obama administration. So if there is something serious, then we can consider this idea. But given that this may not be the case, I think this will be a bad idea, especially and in my subjective view, the current government is not effective, and having 50 or 100 even moderate Islamist fighters will be very difficult to manage for the Georgian government. Therefore, I think that this is a good idea given all the environment. Yes, circumstances.
Sure. And I have 2 points. The first is sort of, what's the purpose of states, right, with respect to security? And the etymology of the word security is interesting. If you think about the word security, it has 2 parts. The first is se, which comes from Latin prefix, the same as like secession or secrete. is away from, free from. And kura means care. So se kura just means a situation in which you are free of care, in which you don't have to worry about extraneous events that might inhibit your natural, organic development. That is the essence of things. And so interest in that sense, in the current state system, are A, minimalistic, survival, but B, they go much further than that. We no longer live in the past. The real ambition, I think, of responsible governance is to make sure that the individuals in their country can develop themselves, that the companies can go and find international niches. That to me is the essence of security. And the traditional definition of security doesn't help us in that. So in many ways, the traditional security people have actually undermined the real security in the original sense of the word. And I think that's something that we should be careful of. Now, if I apply that to situations like Afghanistan, which the mention was, when I look back at 20 years of one particular form of kinetic expeditionary operations, as we have executed them across the world, I cannot be particularly happy with that. We have spent an enormous amount of money, we spilled a lot of blood, of some of ours and even much more of others, and we have not achieved the political effects that we want. Security has not increased because of that. So it's really time for all of us, analysts, politicians, policymakers, policy analysts, to think more clearly about what is the capability bundle, what can we do in order to achieve the security that we have in our minds. We haven't succeeded in it in Afghanistan, which is less secure now than was when we went in. We haven't achieved it in Iraq. Look at what's happening in Iraq. We haven't even, we maybe scratched the surface on it in the Balkans, but we have a much broader, capability bundle that we use there. So this is really sort of an existential moment in European defense and security, in the sense that, some of you may have read that article by Robert Cooper talking about postmodern Europe versus modern America or Russia and pre-modern Afghanistan or Africa. And I think there is something to that. I mean, again, because of our history, we are no longer happy with the modern capability bundle, also because it's becoming very expensive and unacceptably expensive, and it doesn't yield the security effects that we want. So we have to start thinking about different things we can do in countries like, along our southern borders, along our eastern borders. I personally think that capability bundle will be much more in what I call the structural layer of security than the superficial layer of security, and that's what we have to focus on. What are smarter initiatives that we can do in order to achieve these things? And I think it has a lot to do with what I mentioned before, where, for instance, countries like Georgia recognize that it starts with doing your own homework, no longer being so weak, not just militarily, but as a country, investing in those types of things, doing smart things in other types of areas. So again, security is no longer what it has. We have two choices here. We can go back to the past, and much of our environment seems to be pushing us in that direction, both on the east of Europe and on the south of Europe. We have to recognize that our current stance is insufficient. Our neighborhood policy has failed. Our military toolkit has proven to be unaffordable and ineffective. And so where do we go from here? Do we allow ourselves to be pulled back to the demons of the 19th century with nationalism, with...
there was no nationalism in the 19th century. Nationalism is a good time.
Nations started developing for a long period of time. But is that what we want to go back to? Or do we want to forge something new that might be hopefully more effective against those security in the sort of broader sense of the world challenges that we see out there? That is a big challenge. And I, for one, hope that Europe will choose, and some of that is happening. I mean, a lot of interagency discussions that are taking place now in the United Kingdom, in France, in other European countries, very much go in that direction. In fact, in Russia, the same thing is happening as well. So there I see some hope. And yes, we have to defend ourselves. Yes, we still have to look at the military tool, but like Timofey rightly pointed out, NATO spends 10 times more money on military stuff than Russia does. And although it spends it very ineffectively, it's still more effective than Russia does, because there is less corruption in the military realm than there is in Russia. But so we still do a lot in that area. But the real growth area, I think, for defense efforts and security efforts lie in these new things, where we focus societal fibers, where we try to identify what leads to security in these countries and how can we strengthen those, rather than just how do we get the bastards. That's a philosophy, that's a change in mentality that we really have to take much more seriously.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Mine are not actually questions, just a couple of thoughts.
Stephan, sorry.
Okay. mine are not questions, but just a couple of thoughts. If you
please comments, please.
Just comments.
Which could be forwarded to the question.
Maybe. I just want you to know that something about your speeches. You said that Tbilisi, Georgia, is now going back to Europe, like it was before becoming part of Russian Empire. It was European, like pure European country, and now it's going back to its roots. Let's say, of course, no one is like arguing that it's one of the oldest Christian nations and countries, and but I would like to know that, like, Tbilisi is one of my favorite cities, and the architecture that we see now, I mean, apart from churches, is mostly influenced the marbles of Tbilisi of the 19th century, including Roosevelt Avenue. They mostly represent European styles, and most of them were built during this Russian Empire times. So I wouldn't say that, yes, it's a nice tool to say, it's a nice trick to say, and it sounds really beautiful, like we're going back to Europe again, but I a bit disagree with this statement because it seems that Georgia sank into some uncivilized world and was into the east, and there was a piece of negative evaluation about the east, like east is something bad and west is a bit more prioritized. Yes, as for Soviet Union, but it's also arguable that's about the regime. Another comment is about your another part of your speech about you were wondering how come that ancient countries like Georgia and Ukraine, they suffer from this instability, they feel unsafe, and you said that Ukraine, as for Georgia, I have nothing against your thing, but as for Ukraine, you said it's older than Russia, but yes, you're, I think, conveying the Ukrainian point of view in this case, because if you believe that Kievan Rus was, like people were Ukrainians and Yaroslav Mudryk was pure ethnic Ukrainian, then, well, I have nothing to add. But yeah, that's another point of view. But that's also quite a dangerous position, because it might really need to lead to some nationalistic statements from the Ukrainian side. This is a very tricky situation now, and it's dangerous to say things like that, especially in Ukraine, because it's not the right time to show them that you are prioritized and you deserve more in this world than Russia, for example. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
I don't think Stephan considers himself Ukrainian. Yeah, sure. Just a moment. When you're talking about Georgia belonging to Europe, Georgia always belongs to Europe. Well, I think the most important thing is that Georgia wants to be a liberal democracy. That's the point. And no matter how you call it, whether returning to Europe or not, well, I don't think really Georgia always belonged to Europe. Because sometimes we were too heavily influenced by Iran, or sometimes by Ottoman Empire and so on. But mentally somehow we always, let's say, strive there to Europe, to liberal values and freedom. That's it.
Yeah, just a little comment on civilized people. 10 days ago, I was standing on the border control in the Dallas International Airport in Washington. And many people around me have been coughing like this, because of the sickness, flu, I don't know. Suddenly I realized, if I would have been standing in the same queue in Korea, in Japan, in Malaysia, in many cities of China, all those people would have wear their masks on their faces, because they don't want the flu to go to the other people. And this is what I call civilized behavior. And this has no connection to Europe whatsoever. So this is civilized behavior, which I find in nations. And I don't think that for my country, this is a bad idea to look for the civilized behavior, not only in one direction.
Yeah, I think all of us have to learn something good from Asia and something good from Europe. But I noticed one thing. When Russians are reminded about some bad things they've been doing, they always refer to America. Americans do the same things they say.
It was international queue.
No,
Well, just just one point on history. I take your fundamental point that there's a danger in abusing history, and that can be then used by political entrepreneurs for even more extreme points. But I mean, my point about Ukraine and Georgia was that these are all countries that have existed for a long time. You know, like in Ukraine's case, have basically disappeared for a long time. Should have learned that resilience, right, is more than just fighting your neighbors. That there's a variety of different ways in which you, as an entity, a small entity, a weak entity, between larger entities. By the way, Ukraine at the height of its existence, whatever, quite large. But that was the point. Under Ukraine versus Russia, I mean, Kievska Rus, right, was much closer to the historical development in Western Europe in those days than Muscovy was at that point. And so that's sort of the argument. Again, you can manipulate those points. The same thing with Crimea, right? Russia says Crimea is ours. Well, if you look historically, the only country that really has a claim to Crimea is probably Turkey. Because it's right in Greece. So all these things are so relative. We have to go beyond that, and I hope I can go beyond that, right? I'm from Flanders myself. If we wanted to play these kinds of games, we might want to have French Flanders back or Zeeuws-Vlaanderen and Holland back. It doesn't work. That doesn't make any sense in this day and age, right? Where all these fundamental trends that I developed, we should be smarter than that. And especially nations that have been around for a long time, I would hope can be more, adaptive in the way in which they respond to these kinds of things. And there I'm sort of, I think it's unfortunate history still continues to be abused for that reason. And if I led to that, then I apologize. But that's the point I was trying to make.
Maybe once again, Europe and Georgia.
I didn't say that East was bad and West was good. I just said
no, I didn't want to say that you told that, but it was like something.
Yeah, but I was more referring that during its long history, unfortunately, Georgia often didn't have a free choice. And if it had a free choice, I do believe that it would be more towards the West. Because if you read Georgian history, and again, I mean, religion did play a certain role in Georgia's history. We wanted to be closer with Europe, with the West than with the East. And we fought many wars with the same enemies that the European nations used to fight. And then I said that Georgia's incorporation into the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union was not a free choice. And if given a free choice, and I think we should now have a free choice, and when Stephan said that if there are different poles in the international system, and if there's a free choice of choosing one of the poles, then we would choose the Western one.
Any more questions?
ითხოვავს ევროპის მიმართან მაინტერესებს თუ კი რუსეთი ანაგრძობს ახალი ტერიტორიების ოკუპაციას დაიწყოს თუ არა ევროპა საომრობებებს და თუ დაელოდება ან იქნება შეფორდული დაუშვა სინდრომი და დაელოდება სანამ აგრესორი უშუალოდ მის საზღვრებს არ მიადგება და მეორე თქვა რამდენად მზადაა თქვენი აზრით ევროპელი ხალხი ახალი ომისთვის
Well, obviously, we make a clear distinction here between members of NATO or the European Union and non-members. As I suggested before as well, NATO has not taken Article 5, collective defense, very seriously for a long period of time. It is again now. And you see in every aspect of that, whether it's missile defense, whether it's prepositioning with large-scale exercises. We're contemplating again, three core size, which is large, sort of exercises which we haven't trained for a long time, and I've been involved in some of the pre-exercises on that, and it's a nightmare. The extent to which we've neglected these kinds of things are really quite astounding. So we have to really reinvent doctrines. So despite all the things that Russia has said, that you've always been obsessed with Russia, that has really not been the case, and now it's becoming the case again. But that's again Article 5 for those countries that are sort of in there. I should also tell you that throughout the Cold War, a lot of Europeans have always asked these kinds of questions that you're asking now. Would the United States have been willing to sacrifice New York for Hamburg? The supposed salami tactics, right? What we're seeing now is a form of salami tactics again. And it's pretty intelligent salami tactics. You know, it's sort of what they've been writing about for a long time, contactless war, you know, new forms of incremental change which are very hard to detect, which are deniable sometimes, and we don't have very good means yet to really pin these things down. So, but the fundamental answer is that yes, the European and the transatlantic allies are once again devoting a lot more thinking, some more spending, and a lot more activities on the collective defense commitments that have been made. Does that mean that we could repel, that we would repel? That again is a political decision that takes place on every single moment. Bear in mind, those people who haven't read Article 5 of NATO, I would strongly recommend you read it. There is no automatic defense guarantee in there. The United States Senate would never have voted for a real Article 5 that would have said, if we are attacked, all the other ones have to defend. It doesn't say anything like that. It says all the other nations have to do something. And the something is not specified. So the preparations for Article 5 are being beefed up again. The reality of Article 5 is something that will have to depend on the exact situation, will be decided by national policymakers, but of course everything that's happening in the last couple of years made that decision making a little easier actually, or the last month certainly. But that's the answer. Countries that are not member of Article 5 fall out of that. There is a line that has been drawn, which is why Georgia and Ukraine and maybe some others want to be sort of on the other side of the line, which is comprehensible. But the political dynamics right now within NATO haven't really changed that much on that point, I would say. So the military realities have. The political realities, I think, have much less. So that's where we stand. I realize it's a very unsatisfying answer, even for us Europeans, even for the Estonians, let alone for the Ukrainians or the Georgians. But that's really, I think, where we stand.
I just wanted to ask another question concerning the European Union and what the European Union did to Ukraine. Stephan, after the tragic events which has happened in August 2008 after the Georgia emergency, we in Russia wrote in several reports in the articles, and myself did, that these tragic events showed that any attempt to put Ukraine in front of the choice between one bloc or another will drag this beautiful country into the terrible civil war, into the terrible civil war, and mainly to the dissolution, Russian involvement and dissolution of Ukraine. Have we been not explicit enough, or you didn't get the message? No, in our warnings. In our warnings.
This is cynical. The country of Ukraine, just like Georgia, has the independent right to decide where they want to go. That's what Angela Merkel said recently too. If Ukraine wanted to decide, as it did at a certain moment under Yanukovych, not to pursue the Western line or to pursue the Eastern line, it could do so.
But Ukraine was divided 50-50.
Yes, but that's the political leadership of Ukraine makes those decisions. And no matter what you write, Timofey, no matter what Putin says, it is the tough political choice of the country of Ukraine under a very imperfect political constellation to make those kind of choices. It is not ours, nor is it theirs. Our association, everything that we've done in the Eastern dimension was also offered to Russia. This was not an anti-Russian thing.
Please, the question is, have been waiting for us.
Jak raczej sprzedał darmaści, ale ma plus. My raczej sprzedał darmaści teraz, mówisz mi, że jest chcieli być mikromodeli, lisatura, te na te sposób mówisz mi, że jest karteli ekspertevi, rumlevi ძალიან სალადა კარგად ხსნიან მოვლენებს და შემდეგ თუ დარბაზიდან წამოაკითხვა რომ ცოტა ისეთი რაღაც გამოთქვა რომელიც თქვათ კორექტული არ იყო ვიტყო შემდეგ ისე მოამოვალებს კუთხეებს არის ევროპა რომელიც ძალიან რბილად უყურებს ყველაფერს და ძალიან აკადემიურად ხსნის თავისებურად რომელიც მიანიშნებს რომ ასე ვთქვათ თავს უფრთხილდება უფრო მეტად ვიდრე მოვლენებს აგიქვავს ისე როგორც უნდა აგიქვამდეს არის რუსეთი რომელიც ადრეც და ეხლა მithumetes იქცევა სოფლიოში ისე როგორც უკაცრავად შედარებისთვის და ხულიგანი Pici უბანში მოსაზრება რომ ევროპა და ნატო უფრო ბევრ ფულს ხარჯავს შეერაგებაზე ვიდრე რუსეთი და რატო ეს დისბალანსი ასე ვთქვა იმიტომ რომ ზუსტად იმიტომ რაც მე ვთქვი ხულიგანების უბანში შეუძლია მოიქცეს ისევ არაკონტროლოს თავისუფლად ხოლო სხვა რომელსაც შეიძლება ამ ხულიგანებზე მეტი შესაძლებლობები ჰქონდეს ამას არ კადრულობს ეს ცოტა ნიუანსი ყურადღება ამიტომ შეიძლება ასეთ ხულიგანთან ჩვენც ხულიგანი გავხდეთ კარგი რა თქმა უნდა და მიუჩინოთ თავისი ადგილი ამ შესაძლებელი ერთი მცირე კითხვა ბატონმა სტუმარმა ევროპიდან ბრძანა რომ რუსეთი არსებობს სხვა რუსეთიც ჩვენ ცოტათაც ვჯეროდეს რომ არსებობს ორი რუსეთი ამაზე ძალიან დიდ ხანს მიდიოდა საუბარი და დისკუსია საქართველოში მაგრამ მე მგონი საქართველოს უმეტესობას ყოველ შემთხვევაში უკვე აღარ ჯერა რომ არსებობს ორი რუსეთი და დღეს კიდევ ერთხელ დავწუნდი ამაში უსმენდი რა ბატონ ტიმოფეის ძალიან სიმპათიურ ახალგაზრდა კაცს ძალიან განათლებულს მაგრამ ამავე დროს მაინც ამ რუსეთის დიდი იმპერიის ნაწილს ამიტომ მე დღეს კიდევ ერთხელ დავწუნდი რომ ორი რუსეთი არ არსებობს არსებობს ერთი რუსეთი ერთი სტრატეგიით ერთი გეოპოლიტიკური მიზნებით სამწუხაროდ Când Ungera, de oameni cu arsenal. Aici, Ungera, voi nu sunteți arsenalist. Europei cu măsuri.
Yes, well, on both points, because I really disagree with both points. I mean, first of all, it's not because somebody behaves in a hooligan way. Let me give you another example. The first time I arrived here, I went down, I was in a hotel, Coppola, and I walked down to the bridge, and there were a couple of kids there, street kids, who were basically, looking for people with some money, and then they approached them, they begged some money, and you could see that they were trying to steal some money. That's essentially what Putin has done now. It's a sort of small-time crook who thinks that his short-term benefits are helped by this type of land grab. That is a hooligan way of behaving. How do you respond to that? Do I respond to that kid and slap him in the face? I don't know much about those kids. I don't even know whether they're Georgian, whether they're not Georgian, how they ended up in the street, why they ended up doing these kinds of things. We will not, and I think it's fairly firm, we cannot as Europeans, because we are so internally divided, we cannot react in that kind of way. Yes, we still spend a lot of money on defense, and we'll spend a little bit more. But the fundamental discussion that we've been having for a long time about how useful that expenditure is will continue. Despite whether he's a hooligan or not a hooligan, the response to this type of behavior cannot be a return to 19th century, 20th century dog-eat-dog world. Especially not because these other realities are also there. And that brings me to the other Russia. There is another Russia. And a lot of you, even a lot of us, now don't want to see it anymore. We are demonizing Russia to such an extent. But there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are Russian companies that are finding niches in the international world. Timofey is not a demon, He disagreed, he told us himself he disagreed with Ruski Mir. That's not Pirvikana, right? So of course I'm sorry, thank you. Although I do disagree with you on a lot of points, right? But the point is that other Russia we may not see it now. When you watch Pirvikana, since it was taken over by, what's his name? The new head of, forget his name. Kisilov, right. Of course, it is very different. But I cannot imagine that most Russians, just like when you watch TV Canal, and you think, how is this possible? I think a lot of Russians must also start feeling different about this entire propaganda machine, just like it did in the Soviet period. So the other Russia, it is there. It has not died off right away. The people who came on the street for a particular reason are still living in Russia. They still see their future in Russia. They also want a normal Russia, whether it's European or not European doesn't matter, but where they're taken seriously, where their decency is appreciated, where they can express themselves freely, where they feel like their real interests are taken into consideration, and not some imaginary Ruski Mir that might actually end up undermining them. That should be our target. And again, maybe not in the old-fashioned Cold War mentality. Of course there is a different Russia. The same currents of history that are pushing all of us, that are making Georgians different today than they were 20 years ago, that are making Belgians different than they were 20 years ago, are also changing Russian society, Russian economy. The openness to China means that Russia the Chinese companies are oftentimes more internationally competitive than Russian companies are. even that will open them up. That is, we have to keep our eye on the ball and not let our emotions in that sense take over so that we ignore the realities in Russia. That we ignore the fact that hooliganism does not necessarily create hooliganism. You know?
I don't agree.
Do you believe, first of all, in existence of two Russias?
No, I don't. That's a good answer. I just want to ask one thing, Timofey. I don't take up the time with the audience, but Timofey said that if, and he wrote this in his articles, and the Russian government said that repeatedly, that if Ukraine would be dragged into NATO, then it would
No, that was never said. It was an analytical observation.
Even, yeah, I have...
it was not government policy, no government.
Okay. When we wrote that if Ukraine would be dragged into NATO, then it was the split of the nation and Russian intervention. But the Ukrainian government, which came after the Maidan, never said that they would like to be members of NATO. So why did Russia invade an essentially neutral nation? That is the question.
No, two questions for you. First, do you believe in the existence of two Russias?
Yes, well, I believe it. I'm a great believer. As a matter of fact, I'm a great believer. And as a great believer, I believe that there are two Russians, three Russians, four Russians, 145 million of Russians. Now it's right here 47 million of Russians. And I believe that there are several hundred thousands of Georgians, 10 millions of Belgians, and 270 millions of Americans. I don't think that we should try to think in the boxes, to put everybody in the same box, to decide, yes, this nation is a hooligan, straight away. And this nation or group of nations is an old pervert which believe that he can do everything and nobody can do the same. Because during the last 25 years, the West behaved exactly this way. So now what is the most important thing, that we are witnessing the end of the situation which emerged after the end of the Cold War, when there was only one rule in the international relations. The United States can do everything. The others should not. Now we are witnessing the age, and that's why this is so tough. And that's why the conflict is so serious. We are witnessing the beginning of the age when not only the US can rape everybody, but everybody who has the power to do so is starting to do so. I'm sorry for if it sounds opportunistic or cynical, but this is an analytical description. I never worked for the government. I never ever, even day in my life, I worked for the government. My analysis is purely analytical, and that's what we did in our articles. Evaluating the policy of the Russian government, we came to the conclusion that the consequence of spoiling situation in Ukraine by putting this country in front of putting this divided country in front of the choice can make it spring and can bring the civil war in. So it was not our recommendation, it was not a political statement, it was analytical observation.
Let's accept one more question because we are running out of time, but before doing that, I want to repeat myself. Why does Russia learn only raping from the West? West has many good things to do. So why don't you start with copying some good things from the West?
No. We have Wi-Fi in the public transportation in Moscow. We have many things. We have one of the most, in Europe, the most advanced of the electronic trade and financial transactions. We have Yandex Money, Yandex Kошелек, which maybe somebody here is using. We have very advanced technologies and software. We learn many good things.
From now we're going to use Russian software. Now the question for the audience. Only one question, please. We are running out of time.
Where is still the solution for Georgia in order to be a less fragile and less vulnerable country? So I think this is the main. So I have put this question with both our guests, so please.
Well, as I said, I know the government. This This is not my business to speak for my government whatsoever. But I believe that if Georgian authorities and the authorities of two separatist regions will find the political will to talk and to look for the solution, Russia will recognize Georgian Confederation as well as Russia recognized two separatist republics. There are no decisions which are irreversible. Every political decision is irreversible. So this will be my answer to your question.
My recommendation would be to focus on domestic issues. Fragility of a country starts at home. Corruption has improved in this country, but it's still in a category. If you look at Transparency International, Georgia is still in a group of countries that you don't really want to be in. You want to be sort of one group higher or two groups higher. That is possible. There are other small countries that have made those kinds of leaps. So domestic reform is what matters, primarily. And so if a lot of the foreign policy and the security policy people who like to have incantations of national interest to go here or there, but focus a bit more attention on what's happening at home, right? Because that's really where resilience and fragility resides. And in terms of international things, first of all, in terms of the lost territories, the dynamics would change dramatically. If Georgia continues to go on the route that it has, maybe a little bit less slowly in the past years than it did before, if it continues on that route, a lot of these territories will look differently. We no longer live in the 19th century. We do live in a different age. Prosperity matters. Rule of law matters. Those kinds of things are primary investments. And not just from a sort of economic or social point of view, also from a security point of view. And then the international, so the first part is getting your home at right, becoming a pole of attraction to those things that you might have lost, and then to look at how things are developing. For us, of course, Georgia is not primarily in our mind, right? Russia increasing is again. And so we will have to change our entire attitude towards Russia, both at the superficial level, like I said, where we might have to play a bit more hardball, but also at the broader structural level. And I think that's really what we're going to have to be focusing our attention to. But again, resilience, and I think that's something that all nations must have learned over a long period of time, really starts with the fiber of your society. You should never allow the fiber of your society to become so degraded that it becomes corrupt, it becomes poor. That's weakness. And the international aspect is a reflection, I think, of the domestic resilience or absence thereof.
Anything to add?
Yeah, just following on what Stephan said. The situation in Georgia is that around 20% of Georgian territory is occupied by Russian armed forces, and unfortunately, it's not up to the separatist, de facto government to decide what happens there. It's totally under the control of the Russian Federation. But as for the territory which is controlled by the central government, we now have a chance to continue our development, continue to build our state, and this will give us in the long term more security and hope to somehow reintegrate the world.
On this constructive and optimistic note, let me finish our meeting. Thanks a lot to our distinguished speakers, thanks to the organizers, Rob House and Eurasian.